A fist came down on a kitchen table and split the wood clean down the middle. A woman pressed her back to the wall and raised both hands to cover her face. The cup she'd been holding hit the floor and broke apart. The big man stepped closer. She did not run. She'd learned a long time ago that running only made it worse. Out in the yard, through the open door, another man set down his water bucket. He had seen her sleeve slide up that morning. He had seen the marks on her arm, old yellow under fresh purple, all the way up. He had said nothing then. He was about to say something now. His name was Wade Calloway, the quietest rancher in the valley, a man who minded his own business. What he did next, that town never forgot. So stay with me on this one. To understand what Wade Calloway did that morning, you have to go back about 6 weeks, to the day Edith first came to cook at his ranch. Wade ran a modest spread out past the river, a day's ride from a town called Calder. He wasn't a big man and he wasn't a loud one. He'd buried his wife 8 years before and never remarried, and somewhere in those 8 years he'd just about stopped talking unless he had something worth saying. His hands respected him. They didn't always understand him. When a man keeps that quiet, people fill the silence with their own guesses. That spring he needed a cook. The branding season was coming. He had a dozen hands to feed, and the woman who'd cooked for him the year before had moved on to her daughter's place in the next county. So when word came that there was a woman in town looking for the work, Wade rode in and hired her on the spot. Her name was Edith. She was a big woman, heavy-set, broad through the shoulders, the kind of woman a town like Calder had decided long ago was easy to laugh at. Behind her back they called her Big Edith and thought themselves clever for it. To her face, most of them didn't bother speaking at all. She was the woman you handed your plate to and looked straight through. But Wade ate her cooking one time and hired her before she finished her sentence. Believe me, the woman could cook. Biscuits that came apart in steam. Stew that made grown cowhands go quiet at the table. And she worked. First one up, last one down, never a word of complaint. Here's the thing about Edith, though. She was married. Married to a man named Royce Coyle. Now, that name meant something in Calder. The Coyles ran that town the way some families run everything. Avery Coyle wore the sheriff's star and had worn it for 20 years. The Coyles owned the bank. They owned the store. They held paper on half the ranches in the valley, Wade's neighbors among them, and a man who holds your debt holds a piece of your spine. Royce was Avery's nephew, and Royce wore a deputy's badge he'd done nothing to earn. Edith took the cooking job for her own money. That's what she told Wade, and it was true as far as it went. But there was another reason, and Wade started to see it inside the first week. She flinched. That was the first thing. A hand reached past her for a coffee pot, raised too quick, and she pulled back like she'd been struck. Some mornings she moved stiff and careful, like a woman twice her age. She'd set a heavy pot down soft, wincing, and think nobody saw. And there were the marks. A bruise on her wrist she kept tucked under her sleeve. A yellow stain along her jaw she'd turned away to hide. Wade said nothing. A man minds his own business. That was the rule he'd lived by his whole life. Then one evening he went out to the barn for a lantern and found her there, alone, thinking she had the place to herself. She had her sleeve pushed up to the elbow and a tin of horse liniment open beside her, and she was working the salve into her own forearm with 2 fingers, slow, the way you tend a thing that hurts deep. Wade saw her arm before she covered it. Old yellow bruises under fresh purple ones all the way up. He stepped back into the dark before she knew he was there. But he'd seen it. And once a man sees a thing like that, he can't unsee it. He didn't say anything that night, or the next. He told himself it wasn't his business. A married woman, a private matter, the kind of thing folks didn't put their hands into. But he started watching. And the more he watched, the worse it got. She came to work one morning with her lips split and swollen. And when one of the younger hands started to make a joke, Wade looked at him in a way that closed his mouth for the rest of the day. Edith just kept cooking, like it was weather, like it was something that happened to her and not something a person did. That was what got under Wade's skin and stayed there. Not just the marks. The way she'd stopped expecting anyone to care. And then came the morning the hooves came up the lane. Wade was at the trough with a water bucket when he heard them, hard and fast and careless. A horse ridden by a man who didn't care if he ran it into the ground. He looked up and saw Royce Coyle hauling rein in the yard, half out of the saddle, drunk at 9 in the morning, his face already dark with whatever he'd come to do. And Edith was in the kitchen. Wade set the bucket down. He didn't run. He just started walking the way a man walks towards something he's already decided about. By the time he reached the kitchen door, it had already started. Royce had Edith backed against the wall. He'd swept the table with his arm and sent a tin cup to the floor, and his fist had come down on the boards hard enough to crack them. He was shouting, the kind of shouting that isn't words anymore, just noise meant to make a person small. Working like a servant, shaming his name, making the Coyles a laughingstock. He grabbed her by the front of her dress. "Royce," Wade said it once from the doorway. "Quiet." Royce turned. He had the loose, ugly grin of a man who's used to people backing down. "This here's my wife," he said. "This is family business. You walk back out that door, rancher, and we'll forget you ever opened your mouth. Let go of her." Or what? Now here's the thing about Wade Calloway. He'd spent 8 years saying as little as possible. But he hadn't always been a quiet rancher. There were things in his past the town didn't know, and Royce, drunk and stupid and 20 years younger, had no idea what he was standing in front of. Wade crossed the kitchen. Royce let go of Edith and swung. A big, wild, drunk man's punch. Wade wasn't where it landed. He came in under it, took a fistful of Royce's collar, and put him into the cracked table so hard the legs gave out and the whole thing went down in a heap of splinters and tin. Royce came up roaring, and this time his hand went to his hip, to the pistol there. He never cleared leather. Wade's hand closed over the gun and Royce's hand together and twisted, and something in Royce's wrist popped, and the pistol came free into Wade's palm. Then Wade had him by the back of the neck, marched him out the door, across the porch, and threw him down the steps into the dirt of the yard. By now the hands had come running. 6 of them stood around the yard, and they saw all of it. They saw a Coyle deputy, the law's own nephew, sprawled in the dust of the Calloway ranch with his nose bleeding and his gun in another man's hand. That was the moment that couldn't be taken back. You understand that, right? In a town the Coyles owned, you could be afraid of them. You could pay them, bow to them, look away from what they did. What you did not do, ever, was put one of them face down in the dirt in front of witnesses. Wade had just done it. Royce's deputy badge had torn loose in the scuffle and lay in the dirt beside him, the tin star catching the morning light. Wade looked at it. He didn't pick it up. "You're done here," Wade said. "Get on your horse." Royce dragged himself up. Blood ran off his chin. And drunk as he was, hurt as he was, he reached for the one thing he had left, which was the family at his back. "You have any idea what you just did?" he said, and he was almost laughing through the blood. "My uncle is the law in this county. You're a dead man, Calloway. You and that fat sow both. We'll take the ranch. We'll take everything. You hear me?" Wade emptied the bullets from the pistol into his hand, dropped them in his pocket, and tossed the empty gun at Royce's feet. "I hear you," he said. "Now ride." Royce rode. He hauled himself up and turned that lathered horse and went down the lane the way he'd come, looking back twice, hollering threats the wind took apart. And then it was quiet. Wade stood in the yard a while. Then he went back inside. Edith was on her knees on the kitchen floor, picking up the pieces of the broken cup with shaking hands, gathering them into her apron, because that's what she knew how to do. Clean up. Make it like it never happened. Wade crouched down across from her. "Leave it," he said, gentle now. "Leave it, Edith." She looked up at him. And here's the part that stayed with the hands who told this story for years after. She wasn't crying for herself. She was scared for him. "You shouldn't have done that," she whispered. You don't know them. You don't know what they'll do. Maybe, Wade said. But no man hits a woman in my kitchen and rides off easy. Not while I'm standing. He put her in the spare room that night. Told her she wasn't going back to Calder, wasn't going back to Royce, wasn't going anywhere she didn't want to go. Told her the ranch hands would be around and she could sleep with the door shut and not listen for footsteps. She didn't believe him at first. A woman doesn't unlearn fear in an evening. But the next day passed, and nothing came up the lane. And the day after that, nothing. And slowly Edith started to breathe. There was an evening in there, 2 or 3 days on, that the hands remembered as a good one. Edith cooked a supper like she was cooking for kings, and the men ate till they groaned, and somebody told a story that made her laugh. Really laugh, a big warm laugh nobody at that ranch had heard from her before. For a little while it felt like it was over. Like the bad thing had come and been answered and gone. Like a quiet rancher had stood up, and that had been enough. Edith slept through the night for the first time in longer than she could remember. If you're still with me this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Because the quiet didn't last. And what came up that lane next wasn't a drunk man on a lathered horse. It was the law. They came on a Saturday mid-morning and they came slow. That was the difference. Royce had come fast and stupid and alone. Sheriff Avery Coyle came at a walk with 2 deputies flanking him, in no hurry at all, because a man who owns the county is never in a hurry. He had a paper folded in his coat. He had 20 years of the badge on his chest. And he had the calm of a man who had never once, in his whole life, had to wonder whether he'd get his way. Wade came out onto the porch. Avery Coyle looked at him from the saddle for a long moment before he spoke. "Mr. Calloway," he said, "you laid hands on a sworn deputy of this county, broke his wrist, took his sidearm, threw him off your property in front of witnesses." He said it mildly, like he was reading a grocery list. "That's assault on an officer of the law. I could put you in a cell behind that and let the circuit judge sort you out in 3 months' time." "He was beating a woman in my kitchen," Wade said. "He was collecting his wife." Avery shifted in the saddle. "And that's the other matter. You're harboring another man's wife under your roof. Edith is married to my nephew. Lawfully. In the eyes of God and the territory both, that woman belongs in her husband's house, and you're keeping her from it. So here's how this is going to go. You feel it? You feel how the whole thing just changed shape? This wasn't a fistfight anymore. The fistfight Wade had won. This was the law. This was the paper and the star and the marriage and the whole weight of a county that the Coyles had spent 2 decades making their own. Royce had been one drunk man Wade could throw down the steps. Avery Coyle was something you couldn't throw anywhere. He didn't have to raise his voice or his hand. He had everything else. "You'll send Edith out to me now," Avery went on. "She goes home to her husband. You'll come into town Monday and answer for the assault, quiet and reasonable, and maybe I let you keep this ranch instead of finding out how much paper the bank can dig up against a man who can't make trouble from a jail cell. Or," he let the word sit, "or you can be stubborn, and I can ruin you down to the boots you stand in. Your choice. But the woman comes with me today, one way or the other." Wade was quiet a moment. Then he said, "No." Avery Coyle blinked. I don't think he'd heard that word in a long time. "She's not going back to be beaten," Wade said. "Not today. Not Monday. Not ever. You want to bring paper, bring it. You want to bring the circuit judge. I'd be glad of him. But you're not taking her off this porch, Sheriff, so you can turn those horses around." For a moment nobody moved. The 2 deputies looked at Avery. Avery looked at Wade, and the mildness went out of his face, and what was under it was colder and older and a great deal more dangerous. "You've got till the end of the week," he said. "Saturday. I'll come back with everything the law allows. And I will take what's mine, and I will break you doing it, and this whole valley is going to watch me do it, so they remember what happens to a man who forgets his place." He gathered his reins. "Enjoy your week, Mr. Calloway." They rode off slow as they'd come. Now Wade understood the shape of the trap. He had till Saturday. And a week wasn't enough time to do this with fists. The coils couldn't be punched. They had to be answered with something bigger than themselves. So that Monday he rode into Calder, and that's where he learned just how alone he was. The town had heard. Of course it had heard. And the town had already done its arithmetic. At the store, the clerk wouldn't meet his eye and was suddenly very busy. Men who'd tipped their hats to Wade for years found reasons to study their boots. A rancher he'd known 20 years pulled him into a doorway and whispered, "Wade, for God's sake, give her back. They hold my note. They hold everybody's note. I've got children." And then he was gone before anyone could see them talking. That was the thing Wade understood standing in that street. Edith hadn't been overlooked all those years by accident. The whole town had agreed to look away. Not because they were cruel exactly, because they were afraid. The coils had taught a whole town to keep its eyes down, and a woman getting beaten in a back room was just one more thing nobody could afford to see. But Wade did one thing in town that day that nobody noticed. He stopped by the way station and he wrote a letter, and he paid a young rider named Tom Pell good money to carry it hard and fast to the territorial seat, 2 days off. Then he rode home and waited, and he didn't tell a soul what was in that letter, not even Edith. Saturday was coming. The coils were coming. And Wade Calloway had played one quiet card no one had seen him play. Saturday morning, Wade did the last thing anybody expected. He didn't wait at the ranch for them to come. He saddled 2 horses and he and Edith rode into Calder, into the middle of town, and he stopped in the main street and got down and waited. Right out in the open, where everybody could see. Edith was shaking. "What are you doing?" she said. "Why are we here?" "Because what they want to do to you, they want to do it quiet," Wade said. "In a back room. On a ranch nobody's watching. So we're not going to give them quiet. We're going to make them do it in the street, in front of God and everybody, or not at all." It didn't take long. Somebody ran to fetch the coils, and within the half hour here they came. Avery with his star, Royce with his wrists strapped and his face still marked from the week before, and 3 more men carrying rifles. The town came too. Not into the street. To the edges of it. Onto the porches and into the doorways and behind the windows. The whole of Calder, come to watch what happened to the man who forgot his place. Avery Coyle climbed down slow. "You saved me a ride," he said. "I'll give you that." "Last chance, Sheriff," Wade said. "Turn around." Avery almost smiled. "Take her," he said to Royce, and here's where it turned. Here's the part the town of Calder talked about for the rest of their lives. Royce came across that street fast, reaching for Edith, his face twisted up with a week's worth of humiliation and hate. And before Wade could move, Royce backhanded her open and hard, across the face, in the middle of the street, in the full light of a Saturday morning, in front of the entire town. She went down, a big woman, down in the dirt of the main street, and the sound of that slap carried all the way to the porches. And the town saw it. You understand? For years they had let themselves not know. It happened behind doors. It happened where they could pretend. But there is no pretending when a man knocks a woman into the street in front of you in broad daylight. Every soul in Calder saw exactly what Royce Coyle was in that 1 second. The thing they'd all agreed not to see, and there it was, in the dirt, in the sun. Wade had Royce by the throat before he could raise his hand again. One blow, square, and Royce dropped beside his wife and didn't get up. Wade stepped back. He wasn't even breathing hard. Avery's men brought their rifles up. Avery's hand went to his pistol. And that's when Wade Calloway said the thing nobody in that town knew about him. "Before you do that, Sheriff," he said, loud enough for the whole street, "you should know I sent a letter on Monday to the United States Marshal at the territorial seat. Man named Hollis. I rode with him 15 years ago, back when I carried a federal star myself, before I ever bought a cow. He let that land. I told him a county sheriff was beating a woman through his nephew and ruling this town by fear. And I told him I'd be standing in the street this morning, waiting on him. So go on and pull that pistol, Avery. But you're going to want to look up the road first. Every head in Calder turned. And up the road, riding in steady, were 4 men with the dust of 2 days on them and federal badges on their coats. The marshal's name was Hollis, and he was older than Wade and harder to read, and he climbed down in the middle of that street like a man who'd seen the like of it 100 times. He looked at Royce in the dirt. He looked at Edith, who Wade had helped to her feet, a hand pressed to her cheek. He looked at Avery Coyle's hand, still resting on that pistol. "I'd move that hand, Sheriff," Hollis said. "Slow." Avery moved it, and then something happened that nobody had planned, least of all Wade. Edith stepped forward. This woman the whole town had stepped over for years, this woman who flinched and looked away and cleaned up her own blood so nobody would have to see it. She stepped into the middle of that street, and she found her voice. "He's been doing it for 9 years, she said. Her voice shook. Then it didn't. 9 years. And every one of you knew. She turned, slow, and looked at the porches, at the doorways, at all of them. Doc Merrill set my arm twice and was told to write it down as a fall, and he wrote it down as a fall. The Hadleys next door heard it through the wall 100 nights and shut their window. You all knew. You knew, and you decided I wasn't worth the trouble of knowing. She wasn't crying anymore. Well, I'm standing here now, so somebody say it. Say what you saw." For a moment, nothing. The fear the Coyles had built held the whole street still. And then a voice from the boardwalk. Doc Merrill, an old man, stepped down into the street beside her. "She's telling the truth, Marshal," he said. "I've got 9 years of it. I can name every visit. I was a coward, and I'm done being one." Then the Hadley woman spoke up. Then a man who'd watched Royce drag Edith out of the store by the hair 2 summers back and told himself it was none of his business. One after another, the people of Calder stepped down off their porches and into the street, and the silence the Coyles had ruled by for 20 years came apart in front of them. Because it had never been strength. It had only ever been fear. And the moment one man refused to be afraid, and one woman refused to be invisible, there was nothing left to hold it up. Avery Coyle looked around at his town and saw it turning, all of it, every face, and for the first time in his life the man had nothing to say. Hollis put Royce Coyle in irons in the dirt where he lay. Then he turned to Avery. 20 years is a long time to answer for, Sheriff," he said. "We're going to start today." The reckoning, when it came thorough. Royce Coyle went to the territorial prison to wait on the circuit judge, and with Doc Merrill's 9 years of records and half a town willing to swear to what they'd seen, there wasn't a jury in the territory that was going to call it anything but what it was. He would not be back in Calder. Not for a long time, and maybe not ever. Avery Coyle's 20 years came apart slower but just as sure. Marshal Hollis stayed a week and opened up everything. The bank's books, the debts, the way one family had bent a whole county around itself. And when the territory was done looking, Avery Coyle wasn't a sheriff anymore. He was just an old man who used to be feared, which is a smaller thing than he'd ever understood. The star went to a younger man the town actually chose. The bank, with the fear bled out of it, became just a bank. Notes got paid on honest terms. Men stood a little straighter in Calder. Like a weight they'd carried so long they'd forgotten it was there had finally been set down. And Edith, a territory judge, dissolved the marriage inside the year, which was no small thing in those days, but a woman whose husband sits in prison for what he did to her has the law on her side at last. She was free. Free in every way a person can be. She stayed on at the ranch. Wade offered her real wages and a room of her own with a door that locked from the inside, though she said she didn't need the lock anymore, and after a while she took it off herself. She cooked for the hands like she always had, and they ate like kings like they always had. But something was different now, and you'd have seen it the first time you watched her walk down the main street of Calder. Because the town that used to look through her looked at her now. They said her name, Edith, not the cruel one they'd been so clever about for years. That one died in the street that Saturday and nobody dug it back up. Children she passed said, "Good morning, ma'am." The Hadley woman brought her preserves and didn't quite know how to say she was sorry. So she just kept bringing preserves, and Edith let her, which was its own kind of grace. The men who'd studied their boots when she went by now tipped their hats. It had cost them something, looking the other way all those years, and they knew it, and this was them trying to make it right in the small ways people can. As for Wade, he went back to being what he'd always been. A quiet rancher who minded his own business. He didn't make a speech about any of it. When folks tried to thank him, he changed the subject to the weather or the cattle and made it plain the conversation was over. He'd done what he did, and to his mind that was the end of it, and a man doesn't take a bow for doing the one thing a decent man is supposed to do. But there's one more thing, and it's the thing I think about most. A few weeks after that Saturday, Edith came into the kitchen and found Wade there with his tools out. He'd taken the broken table. The one Royce had cracked. The one that had gone to splinters under the man's fist that first morning. And he'd been mending it. New legs. The split boards drawn back together and pegged tight. He'd sanded it smooth and oiled it down, and by the time he was done you could run your hand across the top and barely feel where the break had been. She stood in the doorway and watched him work, and neither of them said much, because they weren't the kind of people who needed to. That's the part that stays with me. The marks on Edith's arm, those were never really hidden. Not from the doctor. Not from the neighbors. Not from a whole town that walked past them every single day. The town just decided, year after year, that she wasn't worth the trouble of seeing. Because the easiest thing in the world is to look away from the person everyone else is already looking away from. Took one man who wouldn't. He wasn't bigger than the Coils. He wasn't louder. He didn't have the law or the bank or the town behind him. He just refused to look away from a woman the whole world had agreed to overlook. And that, it turned out, was the one thing strong enough to bring the whole rotten thing down. So the next time you're tempted to think a person doesn't matter much. Too quiet, too poor, too easy to step over. Remember Edith standing in that street, finally seen. Everybody's worth protecting. Especially the ones the world decided weren't. Wade Calloway never did say more than he had to. But that town never forgot the morning the quietest man in the valley decided he'd seen enough. And neither will you.